The tourist's scream echoed across the Alaskan inlet as the grizzly bear charged toward their overturned kayak. But the old fishing guide didn't panic, didn't shout for help. He just reached under his boat seat and pulled out something that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago. Because some instincts never die, and some training never fades even after 40 years of pretending to be just another weathered Alaskan fishing guide. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this incredible story of hidden identities, survival instincts, and the brotherhood that spans decades of service, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. Some heroes hide in plain sight for reasons you'll understand by the end of this story. The Kenai Peninsula in Alaska is one of the last true wildernesses left in America. A place where nature still holds dominion over man, where survival depends more on instinct than technology, and where the line between life and death can be measured in heartbeats rather than hours. Among its countless inlets, fjords, and hidden coves, charter fishing boats navigate waters that have claimed more vessels than the Coast Guard cares to officially acknowledge. Captain Frank Morrison had been running fishing charters out of Seward, Alaska, for 23 years. His boat, the Northern Solitude, was a weathered 32-foot cabin cruiser that looked like it had seen better decades but ran like a precision instrument. Tourists who booked his services expected a typical fishing experience, maybe catch some salmon, see some whales, take pictures for social media. They never expected to witness what happened on September 14, 2024. The morning started routine enough. Frank had picked up his clients at the Seward Harbor dock at 6 a.m. sharp, same as always. 3 tourists from Seattle, a tech executive named David Chen, his teenage son Marcus, and David's business partner Sarah Williams. They'd booked a full-day charter, hoping to catch some king salmon and maybe spot some orcas. Frank was 67 years old, built like a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. Weathered face, gray beard, eyes the color of winter water. He wore the uniform of every Alaskan guide: flannel shirt, worn jeans, rubber boots that had seen 1,000 fishing trips. His hands were scarred and calloused, his voice quiet but authoritative when he gave safety instructions. Water temperature's 42 degrees, he told his clients as they headed out of the harbor. You fall in, you've got maybe 10 minutes before hypothermia sets in. Stay in the boat, follow my instructions, and we'll all go home with fish stories. The tourists nodded, snapping selfies as Seward disappeared behind them. They had no idea they were in a boat with a man whose real stories could never be told. By 10 a.m., they were 15 miles into Resurrection Bay, anchored near a kelp bed where Frank guaranteed they'd find salmon. The tourists were having the time of their lives. Marcus had already caught 3 fish, Sarah was filming everything for her Instagram, and David was relaxed for the first time in months. That's when they heard the splashing. 200 yards away, a kayaker was in trouble. The bright yellow kayak had flipped, and a man in an orange life jacket was thrashing in the frigid water, screaming for help. But he wasn't alone in the water. A massive Kodiak grizzly bear, at least 8 feet tall and weighing close to 1,500 pounds, was swimming directly toward him. The bear had apparently been fishing in the shallows when the kayaker's panicked flailing had attracted its attention. Now it was closing the distance with the terrifying efficiency of a predator that had never learned to fear humans. David Chen started to reach for his phone to call for help, but Frank was already moving. Not with the hurried panic of a civilian facing an emergency, but with the calm precision of someone who'd been in life-or-death situations before. He reached under his captain's chair and pulled out something that definitely wasn't standard fishing equipment: a military-grade flare gun, the kind used for emergency signaling in combat zones. But this wasn't loaded with a standard distress flare. Frank fired once, directly over the bear's head. The projectile exploded in a brilliant flash of white phosphorus and sound that could be heard for miles. The bear stopped swimming instantly, reared back in the water, and began swimming rapidly away from both the kayaker and the explosion. Then Frank did something even stranger. He reached for his marine radio and spoke into it using language that sounded nothing like standard Coast Guard emergency protocol. Neptune Base, this is Frogman 7, coordinates 60.1048 north, 149.4394 west. I have one civilian in the water, hypothermic, immediate extraction required. Deploying emergency procedures Alpha 77. The response came back immediately, in the same coded language, Frogman 7, Neptune base copies. Coast Guard Dolphin inbound, ETA 12 minutes. Maintain position and assist. Sarah Williams, who had been filming the entire incident, stared at Frank with her mouth open. How did you know those coordinates so precisely? And what was that radio code? Frank didn't answer immediately. He was already throwing a life ring toward the kayaker, calculating distances and water temperature and survival times with the kind of tactical precision that comes from training most civilians never receive. Some things you never forget, he said quietly, hauling the hypothermic kayaker aboard with strength that seemed impossible for a man his age. Even when you're supposed to. 12 minutes later, exactly as Frank had predicted, a Coast Guard helicopter appeared on the horizon. The rescue went smoothly, professionally, like it had been choreographed. The kayaker survived with no permanent damage, the bear was unharmed, and Frank's tourists had a story they'd never forget. But as they headed back to port, David Chen couldn't stop thinking about those radio coordinates, that flare gun, and the way Frank had handled an emergency that would have paralyzed most people. That evening, over beers at a Seward bar, David mentioned the incident to a friend who was a retired Navy officer. His friend listened to the story, asked a few questions about Frank's boat and radio procedures, then got very quiet. David, he said finally, I think your fishing guide might not be exactly what he seems. David Chen was a successful software engineer, which meant he was naturally curious about problems that didn't have obvious solutions. The incident with the bear and the impossibly precise rescue had been bothering him for 3 days. Frank Morrison's reaction had been too professional, too practiced, too unlike any civilian response David had ever witnessed. So he did what any tech-savvy person would do in 2024, he started researching. Finding information about Frank Morrison proved surprisingly difficult. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had his charter license, which showed he'd been operating out of Seward since 2001. His boat was properly registered, his insurance was current, and his safety record was spotless. But beyond that, Frank Morrison seemed to have materialized out of thin air 23 years ago. No social media presence. No newspaper mentions before 2001. No marriage records, no property purchases before his current address, no digital footprint that extended back more than 2 decades. For a man who'd been living in a small Alaskan town for over 20 years, Frank Morrison was remarkably invisible. David's business partner Sarah had a different approach to the mystery. She'd been a journalist before getting into tech, and she knew how to find information that people didn't want found. She started making phone calls to the Seward Harbor Authority, the local Chamber of Commerce, and longtime residents who might remember when Frank had first arrived. What she found was interesting. Frank had shown up in Seward in early 2001 with cash to buy his boat and establish his charter business. He'd rented a small apartment above the marine supply store, paid his rent 6 months in advance, and integrated into the community with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood how to blend in. But nobody remembered where he'd come from. When asked about his past, Frank would mention down south and change the subject. He was friendly enough, competent at his job, and minded his own business. In a state full of people who'd come to Alaska to escape their pasts, Frank's reticence hadn't seemed unusual. Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Helen Kowalski, an 84-year-old widow who'd been running the town's only laundromat for 40 years. Helen saw everything, remembered everyone, and had opinions about all of it. Frank? Helen said when Sarah asked about him. Nice man, keeps to himself. But there's something different about him. You know how most men his age complain about their backs, their knees, all their aches and pains? Frank never mentions any of that. Moves like a much younger man, carries himself like he's ready for trouble. Helen paused, considering her words carefully. And another thing, he's got scars. Old ones. The kind you get from more than just fishing accidents, if you know what I mean. Sarah asked what kind of scars. Bullet wounds, Helen said matter-of-factly. I was a nurse for 30 years before I bought the laundromat. I know what gunshot scars look like. Frank's got at least 3 that I've seen: shoulder, forearm, and what looks like a graze across his ribs. Those aren't hunting accidents. Meanwhile, David was approaching the mystery from a different angle. The radio communications Frank had used during the bear incident had been too professional, too specific, to be improvised. The coordinates he'd rattled off had been accurate to within 10 feet, the kind of precision that required either GPS technology or extensive training in land navigation. But it was the call sign that bothered David most. Frogman 7 wasn't random, it sounded military, specifically naval. And the response from Neptune Base had been immediate and professional, like an established communication protocol. David reached out to his friend Jim Rodriguez, the retired Navy officer who'd first suggested Frank might not be what he seemed. Jim had served 20 years, including time with special operations, and he agreed to make some discreet inquiries through his military contacts. What Jim found was both enlightening and frustrating. There had indeed been a Neptune base, a classified naval facility that had operated in Alaska during the Cold War, conducting training exercises and surveillance operations in the North Pacific. The facility had officially been decommissioned in 1998, but Jim's sources suggested that some operations had continued under different classifications. Frogman was definitely a naval designation, specifically underwater demolition teams and later Navy SEALs. But when Jim tried to research whether there had ever been a Frogman 7 in Alaska, he hit a wall of classified information that suggested he was asking about something that officially didn't exist. David, Jim said during their phone conversation, I think your fishing guide might be former UDT or SEAL. The coordination with the Coast Guard, the precision of his navigation, the way he handled that emergency, those are all indicators of someone with advanced military training. But why would a Navy SEAL be running fishing charters in Alaska? David asked. That, Jim replied, is a very good question. Sarah's research was yielding similar mysteries. She'd managed to track down Frank's landlord from his first apartment in Seward, a man named Pete Carlson who'd owned half the buildings on the waterfront until his retirement in 2015. Frank was a strange tenant, Pete told her. Paid cash for everything, never complained about anything, kept the place cleaner than most people keep their own homes. But the weird thing was, he'd disappear sometimes. Not for days or weeks, but just for a few hours at odd times. I'd see his truck in the parking lot, but he wouldn't be in his apartment. Pete paused, remembering. And he had visitors sometimes. Not friends, not social visits. Official-looking people in suits who didn't look like they belonged in Alaska. They'd meet with him for an hour or two, then leave. This went on for maybe the first 5 years he was here, then stopped. Did you ever ask him about it? Sarah inquired. Once, Pete said. Frank just smiled and said he was doing some consulting work for his old employer. When I asked what kind of consulting, he said it was better if I didn't know. The way he said it made me not want to ask again. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture that raised more questions than it answered. Frank Morrison appeared to be a highly trained former military operator who'd settled in Alaska under circumstances that suggested witness protection or some other kind of government arrangement. But protection from what? And why the continued secrecy after more than 20 years? David decided to take a direct approach. He booked another fishing charter with Frank, this time alone, with the intention of asking direct questions and seeing how Frank responded. October 3, 2024. The morning air in Seward Harbor was crisp enough to see your breath, and the water was glass calm as David Chin walked down the dock toward Frank Morrison's boat. This time, he wasn't coming as a tourist looking for a pleasant day of fishing. He was coming for answers. Frank was already aboard the Northern Solitude, checking equipment with the same methodical precision David had noticed during their first trip. The old fishing guide looked up as David approached, and something in his expression suggested he knew this wasn't going to be a typical charter. Morning, David, Frank said, his voice carrying a note of caution. Bit cold for fishing today. You sure you want to head out? I'm sure, David replied, stepping aboard. But I'm not really here for the fish. Frank continued his equipment check, but David could sense a tension that hadn't been there before. The guide's movements became more deliberate, more controlled, like a man preparing for a conversation he'd been dreading. They cruised out of the harbor in silence, the only sound the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the whisper of water against the hull. 20 minutes into the trip, when they were well away from shore and any possible eavesdroppers, David decided to make his move. "Frank," he said, "I've been doing some research since our last trip." "About you." Frank's hands never stopped working with the fishing gear, but David saw his shoulders tense slightly. "That so? Find anything interesting?" "Not as much as I expected. In fact, that's what's interesting, how little there is to find. It's like Frank Morrison didn't exist before 2001. Frank tied off a fishing line with precision that belonged more in an operating room than on a fishing boat. Lots of people come to Alaska to start over, David. Fresh beginnings, new identities. It's not unusual. But your radio communication during the bear incident was unusual. Those coordinates were too precise, that call sign was too specific, and the response was too professional for random Coast Guard protocol. Now Frank did stop working. He straightened up slowly, and when he looked at David, his eyes held a weight that hadn't been there during their previous interactions. "You're asking questions that might have answers you're not prepared to hear. Try me." Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying David's face like he was evaluating a potential threat or ally. The boat continued its steady cruise through the calm waters of Resurrection Bay, and somewhere in the distance, a whale's blow created a momentary spout of mist on the horizon. "David," Frank said finally, "there are some stories that can't be told. Not because they're classified, though some of them are, but because telling them would put people in danger. People who are still alive, still serving, still carrying out missions that keep this country safe. But you're not still serving, are you? You're running fishing charters in Alaska." Frank's laugh was quiet and held no humor. "You think service ends when you take off the uniform? Some of us never really stop serving, David. We just serve in different ways, in different places, with different covers." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan morning. Cover stories? Frank Morrison, fishing guide, is a cover story. A very good one, maintained for 23 years. But it's still a cover. The admission hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. David had suspected Frank was hiding his past, but he hadn't expected him to admit it so directly. "Who are you really?" David asked. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out something David hadn't expected, a military identification card, worn and faded, but still readable. The name on the card wasn't Frank Morrison. Chief Petty Officer Francis Michael Kowalski, United States Navy. Underwater Demolition Team 12, later SEAL Team 3. 30 years of active service, 1971 to 2001. David stared at the ID card, his mind racing. "Kowalski? But your name is Morrison." "Morrison is my mother's maiden name. I've been using it since I settled in Alaska. Frank is still my first name, just shortened from Francis." "Why the false identity?" Francis took back the ID card and tucked it away carefully. "Because there are people in this world who would very much like to find the men who conducted certain operations during the Cold War. Operations that were successful enough to make some very dangerous enemies." "What kind of operations?" "The kind that officially never happened. Underwater insertions into Soviet naval facilities. Intelligence-gathering missions that violated every international treaty we'd ever signed. Sabotage operations that prevented nuclear weapons from reaching certain unfriendly countries." Frank's voice took on the matter-of-fact tone of someone reciting mission parameters. SEAL Team 3 conducted 847 classified operations between 1975 and 1990. Missions that ranged from reconnaissance to direct action to things that don't have names in any military manual. "And you were part of all that?" "I was the team leader for the last 12 years of my active service. My specialty was underwater demolition and cold weather operations, which is why they stationed me in Alaska after the Soviet Union collapsed." Someone had to maintain the networks we'd built, debrief the assets we'd recruited, and keep an eye on Russian naval activity that didn't stop just because the Cold War officially ended. David was beginning to understand the scope of what Frank was telling him. So Frank Morrison, fishing guide, was actually an active cover identity for a serving Navy SEAL? For the first 10 years, yes. I was officially retired but actually conducting surveillance and intelligence operations throughout the North Pacific. The fishing charter business gave me legitimate reasons to be on the water, to know every inlet and cove, to have relationships with local authorities and Coast Guard personnel. What about the last 13 years? Frank was quiet for a moment, watching the water ahead of them with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades navigating dangerous waters. Officially retired as of 2011. Unofficially, let's just say that certain phone calls still get made, certain favors still get asked, and certain kinds of help are still provided when needed. Like coordinating with the Coast Guard during emergency rescues? The helicopter that picked up that kayaker wasn't regular Coast Guard, David. It was a Navy bird operating out of a facility that doesn't appear on any public maps. The rescue was coordinated through channels that most people don't know exist. David felt like he was looking at an iceberg and just beginning to understand how much was hidden beneath the surface. How many people know who you really are? In Seward? Maybe 3 or 4, and they're all people with security clearances who have their own reasons for being here. In Alaska? Maybe a dozen. In Washington? Enough to make sure my cover stays intact and my pension gets deposited every month. And the rest of the world? The rest of the world knows Frank Morrison, a retired fishing guide who's never been anywhere more exotic than Seattle and whose biggest accomplishment is knowing where to find salmon. They fished in contemplative silence for the rest of the morning, though neither of them paid much attention to whether anything was biting. David's mind was reeling with the implications of what Frank had told him, and Frank seemed to be evaluating whether he'd made a mistake by trusting a civilian with information that could endanger operations he'd spent decades protecting. As they headed back to port, David asked the question that had been building since Frank's first admission, "Why are you telling me this?" Frank's answer came without hesitation, "Because 3 days ago, you and your friends witnessed something that could have blown my cover if you'd started asking the wrong people the right questions. Better that you know the truth and understand why it needs to stay secret than have you stumble into something that could get people killed." What people? David, there are currently 7 former UDT and SEAL operators living under assumed identities in Alaska. We're all here for the same reason. We conducted operations that made enemies who don't forget and don't forgive. Our covers aren't just about protecting classified information. They're about staying alive. As they tied up at the Seward dock, Frank made one final request. "David, I need your word that this conversation never happened. Not just for my sake, but for the sake of men who are still out there, still serving, still risking their lives to keep this country safe." David Chen, successful software engineer and weekend fisherman, found himself shaking hands with a man who'd spent 30 years in the shadows, protecting secrets that could never be shared and carrying burdens that could never be set down. "You have my word," David said. And he meant it. But David Chen was a problem solver by nature, and Frank's revelations had only raised more questions in his mind. Over the next 2 weeks, he found himself researching Cold War naval operations, SEAL team histories, and the shadowy world of intelligence operations that had continued long after the official end of hostilities between the United States and Russia. What he discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The underwater demolition teams had evolved into the Navy SEALs in 1962, but their mission had expanded far beyond their original role of clearing beach obstacles for amphibious assaults. During the Cold War, SEAL teams had conducted hundreds of covert operations in hostile waters, infiltrating Soviet naval bases, planting listening devices on submarine hulls, and gathering intelligence that had helped prevent World War III. But it was what David found about SEAL Team 3's operations in the North Pacific that made him understand why Frank Kowalski had been living under an assumed identity for more than 20 years. According to declassified documents that had only been released in 2019, SEAL Team 3 had conducted what was codenamed Operation Neptune's Trident between 1979 and 1989. A series of underwater infiltrations of Soviet naval facilities in the Bering Sea and Arctic Ocean. The operations had been so successful that they provided NATO forces with detailed intelligence about Soviet submarine capabilities, naval communication systems, and planned military operations. But the operations had also resulted in the death of at least 40 Soviet naval personnel, the destruction of 2 submarine prototypes, and the theft of classified materials that had given the United States a decisive advantage in underwater warfare technology. In 1990, according to a heavily redacted CIA document David found in the National Security Archive, the Soviet Union had issued a classified bounty for the capture or elimination of the SEAL team members who had conducted Operation Neptune's Trident. The bounty hadn't been withdrawn when the Soviet Union collapsed. It had been inherited by Russian organized crime groups and rogue intelligence operatives who viewed the American operators as unfinished business. David was beginning to understand why Frank Kowalski had become Frank Morrison, and why he'd chosen to disappear into the Alaskan wilderness where he could blend in among other people who'd come north to escape their pasts. But there was more to the story, and David discovered it by accident while researching the Coast Guard facility that had provided the helicopter during the kayaker rescue. The facility officially didn't exist. According to public records, there was no Coast Guard installation at the coordinates Frank had used for his radio communication. But satellite imagery showed a small, heavily secured compound with helicopter landing pads, communication arrays, and buildings that looked more military than civilian. Further research revealed that the facility was actually a joint Navy-CIA listening post, established during the Cold War to monitor Russian naval activity in the North Pacific. The installation had been officially closed in 1991, but David's analysis of recent satellite imagery suggested it was still very much operational. Which meant that Frank's unofficial retirement might not be as unofficial as he'd claimed. David's suspicions were confirmed when he noticed something he'd missed during their fishing trip. Frank's marine radio wasn't a standard civilian model. It was military-grade equipment capable of encrypted communication with government facilities. The kind of radio that couldn't be purchased commercially and wasn't supposed to exist on civilian vessels. So David made a decision that he would later realize was either very brave or very stupid. He decided to confront Frank again. This time with the information he discovered about Operation Neptune's Trident and the listening post that officially didn't exist. On October 20th, he booked another charter, once again alone, and once again with questions Frank probably didn't want to answer. This time, Frank was waiting for him. "You've been busy," Frank said as David boarded the Northern Solitude. "Asking questions, researching things that perhaps shouldn't be researched." David felt a chill of apprehension. "How do you know what I've been researching?" "David, you used your home computer to access classified government databases, your work computer to analyze satellite imagery of restricted military installations, and your phone to make inquiries about operations that are still classified at the top secret level. Did you really think nobody would notice?" The implication was clear. Frank's people, whoever they were, had been monitoring David's activities. The realization was both frightening and oddly reassuring. Frightening because it meant he was now part of a world where private citizens could be surveilled by their own government. Reassuring because it meant Frank had trusted him enough to have him watched rather than simply eliminated. "I needed to know if you were telling me the truth," David said. "And what did you conclude?" "I concluded that you weren't telling me the whole truth. Frank Morrison isn't just a retired SEAL living under an assumed identity. He's still operational, isn't he?" Frank started the boat's engine and began navigating out of the harbor with the same practiced ease David had observed before. But this time, David noticed details he'd missed previously: the way Frank's eyes constantly scanned the water and shoreline, the way his free hand always remained near what looked like a concealed weapon, the way he positioned the boat to maintain maximum maneuverability and lines of sight. "David," Frank said as they cleared the harbor, "I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm going to ask you to make a decision that will affect the rest of your life." "What kind of decision?" "Whether you want to know the truth, the complete truth, about what I do and why I do it. Because once you know, you can't unknow. And once you know, you become part of the operational security concerns that govern my life and the lives of several other people." David thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. "I want to know." Frank nodded like he'd expected that answer. Operation Neptune's trident never really ended, David. The Soviet Union collapsed, but Russia didn't stop being a threat to American interests in the Pacific. If anything, they became more dangerous because they became more desperate. Frank adjusted their course slightly, heading toward what looked like empty ocean but was actually, David realized, a very specific set of coordinates. The listening post you found in the satellite imagery is called Neptune Base. It's been operational continuously since 1963, despite what the public records say. Its mission is to monitor Russian naval activity, intercept communications, and coordinate with assets throughout the Pacific region. Assets like you? Assets like me. I'm what's called a non-official covert operative. NOC, for short. I have no official connection to the U.S. government, no military record that can be traced, no paper trail that leads back to any intelligence agency. If I'm caught or killed, the government can truthfully deny any knowledge of my existence. But you are working for the government? I'm working for my country, David. Sometimes that means working with the government, sometimes it means working around the government, and sometimes it means working despite the government. They were approaching what looked like a small, rocky island that David didn't remember seeing on any nautical charts. As they got closer, he realized it wasn't a natural formation, it was a camouflaged installation built to look like a rocky outcropping from a distance. Neptune Base, Frank said simply. Home sweet home. As they pulled alongside a concealed dock, David saw armed personnel in civilian clothes watching their approach. These weren't Coast Guard personnel or civilian contractors. These were operators, the kind of men who moved with the same controlled precision Frank displayed, who watched everything and revealed nothing. Frank, David said, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what he'd stumbled into, what exactly do you do here? Frank's smile was the first completely genuine expression David had seen from him. David, welcome to the most important military installation that doesn't exist. We monitor Russian submarine movements throughout the North Pacific, intercept communications from intelligence operatives operating under diplomatic cover, and coordinate with assets throughout Alaska who are keeping track of activities that could threaten American national security. And the fishing charter business? Perfect cover. I can be anywhere in these waters for any reason, I have legitimate contact with local authorities and maritime personnel, and I can transport people and equipment without attracting attention. As they tied up at the dock, Frank made one final revelation. David, you're not the first civilian who's figured out more than they should have about my activities. But you are the first one who's shown enough discretion and intelligence that we're considering making you an offer. What kind of offer? The kind that would give your software development skills a purpose beyond making rich companies richer. The kind that would let you serve your country in ways you never imagined possible. David Chen, weekend fisherman and successful software engineer, suddenly found himself at the center of a world where the Cold War had never really ended, where American operatives still conducted missions that officially didn't happen, and where the price of freedom was paid by men and women whose names would never appear in history books. Think about it, Frank said as they walked toward the installation that didn't exist. But think quickly. Because once you walk through that door, your old life ends and something entirely different begins. Neptune Base was unlike anything David Chen had ever imagined. From the outside, it looked like a natural rock formation rising from the waters of Resurrection Bay. But once Frank led him through a concealed entrance, David found himself in a sophisticated military installation that hummed with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of serious, ongoing operations. The interior was a maze of corridors carved directly into the rock, lined with military-grade communications equipment, computer terminals, and monitoring stations that tracked everything from submarine movements to satellite communications. Personnel moved through the facility with the purposeful quiet of people who understood that their work was both critical and secret. Frank introduced David to the installation's commanding officer, a woman who appeared to be in her early 50s with the bearing of someone who'd risen through the ranks by being smarter and tougher than everyone around her. David, meet Commander Sarah Mitchell. Sarah, this is the civilian I told you about, the one who's been asking inconvenient questions. Commander Mitchell studied David with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance, posture, and demeanor. Mr. Chen. Frank tells me you're a software engineer with a talent for finding information that's supposed to stay hidden. I'm curious about problems that don't have obvious solutions, David replied. And how do you feel about problems that don't have legal solutions? The question hung in the air like a test. David realized that his answer would determine whether he walked out of Neptune Base as a civilian sworn to secrecy or as something else entirely. I think there are times when legal solutions aren't sufficient to protect the things that matter most, he said carefully. Commander Mitchell nodded approvingly. Frank, take Mr. Chen to the briefing room. I think it's time he understood what we're really doing here. The briefing room was a windowless chamber dominated by multiple screens showing real-time satellite imagery, naval tracking data, and communications intercepts. Frank gestured for David to sit at a conference table while he activated a presentation that David suspected very few civilians had ever seen. David, what you're about to learn is classified at levels that require congressional notification to discuss. You'll be asked to sign documents that will legally bind you to secrecy for the rest of your life, and violation of that secrecy will result in federal prosecution under the Espionage Act. David nodded, though his mouth had gone dry. Neptune Base is the command center for Operation Deep Current, the ongoing mission to monitor and counter Russian intelligence activities throughout the North Pacific region. Despite what most Americans believe, the Cold War never really ended. It just became more subtle, more technological, and more dangerous. The screens around the room displayed a bewildering array of information, submarine positions, communication intercepts, personnel tracking data, and what looked like real-time surveillance of various locations throughout Alaska. Russia currently operates at least 12 intelligence networks in Alaska, Frank continued. Some are focused on military installations like Fort Wainwright and Elmendorf Air Force Base. Others monitor our oil pipeline infrastructure, our missile defense systems, and our Arctic shipping routes. But the most dangerous network is focused on our submarine operations. Russian intelligence has been trying for 40 years to identify and eliminate the SEAL team members who conducted Operation Neptune's Trident. They've succeeded in locating and killing 4 of my former teammates. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan climate. They've been murdering American military personnel? Former military personnel, Frank corrected. Men who were officially retired, living under assumed identities, trying to build civilian lives. But the Russians have long memories and longer reach than most people realize. Frank activated another screen showing photographs of 4 men, all appearing to be in their 60s or 70s, all with the weathered appearance of people who'd spent their lives working outdoors. Tommy Rodriguez, found dead in his fishing boat off the coast of Oregon in 2019. Officially ruled an accident, but the autopsy showed he'd been injected with a paralytic agent before he drowned. Mike Sullivan died in a hunting accident in Montana in 2020, except the ballistics analysis showed he was shot with a rifle that fires ammunition only available to Russian military forces. The litany continued with 2 more deaths, each officially accidental, each actually assassination by operatives who tracked down men who'd been living peaceful civilian lives for more than 20 years. James Kowalski's no relation to me, despite the name, died in a car accident in Wyoming in 2021. Brake failure on a mountain road, except forensic analysis showed the brake lines had been cut with precision tools. And Robert Chen, again, no relation to you, suffered a heart attack while hiking alone in Colorado in 2022. The autopsy found traces of a synthetic toxin that mimics cardiac arrest. David stared at the photographs, understanding for the first time the real scope of what Frank had been living with for more than 2 decades. They've been systematically hunting down your entire team. Not just my team, David. Every SEAL team member who participated in classified operations against Soviet targets during the Cold War. Russian intelligence has compiled what they call the dead list, the names of American operators who they believe need to be eliminated to settle old scores. Frank activated another screen showing a map of Alaska with various markers scattered across the state. There are currently 7 of us left, all living under assumed identities in Alaska. We chose Alaska because it's remote, because the population is transient enough that newcomers don't attract attention, And because the environment itself provides natural security, it's hard to conduct surveillance operations when you're dealing with weather that can kill you. But also because Alaska is where Neptune Base is located, and Neptune Base provides us with the intelligence, communications, and operational support we need to stay ahead of the people who want us dead. David was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. So you're not just retired SEALs hiding from your past. You're active intelligence operatives using your civilian covers to conduct ongoing operations. Exactly. Frank Morrison, fishing guide, can go anywhere in these waters without attracting attention. He can transport people and equipment, conduct surveillance, meet with sources, and coordinate with other assets throughout the region. And if Frank Morrison disappears one day, people will assume he had an accident or decided to move somewhere warmer. Commander Mitchell entered the briefing room and took a seat across from David. Mr. Chen, Frank has given you the background. Now let me explain why you're here. She activated a presentation that showed David's photograph, along with detailed information about his education, employment history, and personal life. 3 weeks ago, you witnessed an incident that could have compromised one of our most valuable assets. Your subsequent research activities demonstrated both intelligence and discretion, but also showed that you have skills we need. What kind of skills? You're a software engineer specializing in data analysis and network security. You successfully penetrated classified government databases, analyzed satellite imagery of restricted installations, and compiled intelligence reports that were more accurate than some of our official assessments. David felt simultaneously flattered and terrified. I was just curious about Frank's background. Mr. Chen, in the space of 3 weeks, you independently discovered the existence of Neptune Base, identified the connection between Frank's charter business and military operations, and compiled a profile of Russian intelligence activities in Alaska that matched classified assessments our analysts had been working on for months. Commander Mitchell leaned forward, her expression serious. We need people with your analytical skills, your technical expertise, and your ability to think outside official channels. More specifically, we need civilians who can provide capabilities that military personnel can't. What kind of capabilities? Frank can conduct surveillance operations, but he can't hack into Russian intelligence networks without creating electronic signatures that could be traced back to U.S. military operations. You can. Frank can transport personnel and equipment, but he can't develop the software systems we need to track and counter enemy surveillance without revealing that the software was created by government programmers. You can. Frank can coordinate with local authorities and maritime personnel, but he can't create the civilian infrastructure we need to support operations that officially don't exist. You can. David realized he was being recruited for something far more complex and dangerous than he'd initially understood. You want me to become a spy? We want you to become what we call a technical asset, a civilian with specialized skills who provides support for operations that require plausible deniability. You'd maintain your day job, your civilian identity, and your normal life. But you'd also use your technical expertise to support operations that protect American interests in ways that can't be acknowledged officially. Frank added, David, Russian intelligence networks in Alaska are becoming more sophisticated and more aggressive. They're using advanced surveillance technology, encrypted communications, and cyber warfare techniques that our traditional military assets aren't equipped to counter. We need people like you, civilians with cutting-edge technical skills who can operate outside the constraints that limit official government operations. Commander Mitchell activated another screen showing what appeared to be organizational charts. Mr. Chen, Operation Deep Current currently employs 47 civilian assets throughout Alaska. Software engineers, communications specialists, logistics coordinators, financial analysts, people whose day jobs provide them with skills and access that complement our military capabilities. These civilians live normal lives, work regular jobs, and maintain their civilian identities. But they also provide critical support for operations that keep Russian intelligence from gaining strategic advantages in the Arctic region. David studied the organizational chart, noting the complexity of the network. What would you expect me to do? Initially, you'd help us upgrade our communication security, develop better methods for tracking Russian intelligence activities, and create software tools that help us coordinate with civilian assets throughout the region. Eventually, if you prove reliable and effective, you might be asked to conduct more active operations, penetrating Russian computer networks, disrupting enemy communications, or providing technical support for field operations. Frank leaned back in his chair. David, I've been doing this for over 20 years. The work is dangerous, the hours are irregular, and the stress of maintaining operational security never goes away. But it's also the most important work I've ever done. The operations we conduct from Neptune Base have prevented Russian intelligence from mapping our submarine patrol routes, intercepting our military communications, and identifying our strategic assets throughout the Pacific region. More specifically, the intelligence we've gathered has helped prevent 3 separate attempts to sabotage our missile defense systems, identified and neutralized 17 Russian intelligence operatives, and provided early warning that prevented Russian submarines from surveilling our naval exercises. Commander Mitchell stood up, signaling that the briefing was coming to an end. Mr. Chen, you have 24 hours to decide whether you want to join Operation Deep Current. If you decline, you'll be asked to sign a secrecy agreement and return to your civilian life with no further contact from us. If you accept, you'll undergo 3 months of training at a facility that doesn't officially exist, learn skills that aren't taught in any civilian institution, and become part of an operation that will define the rest of your life. Think carefully about your decision. This isn't just a job, it's a calling. And once you answer that calling, there's no going back to the person you were before. As Frank prepared to take David back to Seward, Commander Mitchell made one final comment. Mr. Chen, most Americans have no idea how many threats their country faces every day, or how much effort goes into keeping them safe. The work we do here ensures that most Americans never have to know. The question is whether you want to be one of the people who knows, or one of the people who gets to remain blissfully unaware. The boat ride back to Seward was mostly silent, with David lost in thought and Frank respecting his need to process what he'd learned. As they tied up at the dock, Frank made an observation that would prove to be prophetic. David, in my experience, people don't stumble into situations like this by accident. Something about you was ready to discover what you discovered, ready to ask the questions you asked, ready to hear the answers you heard. The real question isn't whether you're capable of doing this work, you've already proven that. The real question is whether you're ready to accept the responsibility that comes with knowing what you now know. That night, David sat in his hotel room overlooking Resurrection Bay, trying to reconcile the peaceful Alaskan scenery with the hidden world of intelligence operations, Russian assassinations, and covert facilities that he discovered existed just beneath the surface. He thought about his comfortable life in Seattle, his successful software company, his apartment with a view of Puget Sound, his friends who worried about stock options and dating apps, and whether their favorite restaurant would have a table available on Friday night. All of that seemed impossibly distant now, like artifacts from someone else's life. He also thought about Francis Kowalski, who'd spent more than 20 years living a lie so complete that he'd become the lie. Who'd sacrificed his real identity, his personal relationships, and his chance at a normal life to serve his country in ways that would never be acknowledged or rewarded. And he thought about the 4 dead SEALs whose photographs Frank had shown him, men who tried to build civilian lives after their military service, only to be hunted down and killed by enemies who'd never forgotten and never forgiven. The next morning, David called the number Commander Mitchell had given him. "I'm in," he said simply. "I thought you might be," she replied. "Frank will pick you up at the dock in 1 hour. And Mr. Chen? Welcome to the war that never ended." 3 months later, David Chen officially took a leave of absence from his software company to pursue consulting opportunities in Alaska. His friends thought he'd suffered some kind of midlife crisis and decided to become a fishing guide. They weren't entirely wrong. By day, David ran a small computer consulting business out of an office in downtown Seward, helping local businesses with their IT needs and providing technical support for the tourism industry. It was exactly the kind of unremarkable civilian life that provided perfect cover for other activities. By night, and during carefully scheduled fishing trips with Frank, David developed some of the most sophisticated counterintelligence software ever created by American intelligence services. His programs monitored Russian communications throughout the North Pacific, tracked the movements of suspected intelligence operatives, and provided early warning of potential threats to American military installations. The work was exactly as challenging, dangerous, and meaningful as Commander Mitchell had promised. 6 months after his recruitment, David was working late in his office when Frank appeared at his door with an expression David had learned to recognize. Something important was happening. "We've got a situation," Frank said. "Russian intelligence has identified 2 more members of our team. They're planning simultaneous operations in Anchorage and Fairbanks, and we have less than 48 hours to prevent them. What do you need me to do?" "What you do best. Find the information we need, disrupt their communications, and help us stay one step ahead of people who very much want us dead." David saved his work, locked his office, and followed Frank into the Alaskan night. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of helicopter rotors, probably another Coast Guard operation that wasn't what it seemed. As they walked toward the dock where the Northern Solitude waited, Frank made an observation that perfectly captured the strange new reality of David's life. "You know, David, most people think the biggest challenges in life come from pursuing your dreams or overcoming your fears. But sometimes the biggest challenge is simply accepting who you really are and what you're really meant to do." David looked out over the dark waters of Resurrection Bay, knowing that somewhere beneath the surface, submarines moved through depths that held secrets most people would never imagine. Above them, satellites tracked movements and intercepted communications in a war that had no declared battlefield and no acknowledged combatants. "Frank," he said, "I think I'm beginning to understand what you mean." They climbed aboard the Northern Solitude and headed out into waters that looked peaceful but harbored some of the most dangerous secrets in the world. Behind them, the lights of Seward twinkled like stars reflected on water. Ahead of them, Neptune Base waited with new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to serve their country in ways that would never be recorded in any official history. Some men find their calling in boardrooms or classrooms or courtrooms. Others find it in hospitals or laboratories or concert halls. And some find it in the hidden spaces between the official world and the real world, where the price of freedom is paid by people whose names will never be known and whose sacrifices will never be acknowledged. David Chen, former software engineer and current fishing guide, had found his calling in the most unlikely place imaginable, aboard a fishing boat operated by a man who'd been dead for 23 years, heading toward an installation that didn't exist, to fight a war that had never officially begun and would probably never officially end. The Northern Solitude disappeared into the darkness, carrying 2 men who'd chosen to serve their country in ways that required them to sacrifice everything most people considered important: recognition, credit, the simple satisfaction of being known for who they really were. But as Frank had told David on that first day when everything changed, some things are more important than being known. Some things are more important than being recognized. Some things are worth any sacrifice, any risk, any price. Freedom is one of those things. And in the waters off Alaska, where the Cold War never really ended and the price of peace is eternal vigilance, men like Frank Kowalski and David Chen continue to pay that price, one mission at a time, one secret at a time, one life at a time. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like Frank Morrison? Someone whose quiet competence and unassuming manner masked a lifetime of service to something greater than themselves? Someone who chose duty over recognition, service over comfort, sacrifice over safety. Share their story in the comments. Let's honor the quiet guardians who watch over us from the shadows, the ones who never asked for thanks but deserve our deepest respect. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us keep these voices alive. Because every day, somewhere in the world, men and women like Frank and David are standing watch, keeping us safe, protecting secrets that ensure our freedom continues. And sometimes, the most important heroes are the ones we never know existed.